prosperity. You know, it's one of the things I always promised myself was that I would never get up and share just from a knowledge of something I read, that my intention is to always share something that I'm either experiencing or that I'm going through or I've learned. And but I've kind of gotten to this place where I'm getting kind of mystical, because whatever I get up here and talk about, that happens to me next week. So I'm like, okay, let's talk about prosperity. Let's talk about something else really cool. I picked up this little book, Living from the Overflow, in the bookstore. And I don't know if they have more of these, but I'm going to be talking on this idea of prosperity and abundance over the next couple of weeks. And Reverend Dr. Michael Beckwith has 7 steps that he talks about with prosperity. And can we turn this down? And so I want to start sharing those with you and kind of sharing my thoughts about it as well. So our title of our talk today is Living in the Overflow. You can see Annette's cute little design here. And the purpose is to remind us that we are tapped into the allness of the divine and that it is all good and that we have access now. You know, I have this thing about cars. I recently bought a new car and I'm really pleased with it. But when I was growing up, we always had this thing about cars where, you know, I grew up in South Los Angeles, and growing up in South Central, you had to have a decent car because there wasn't a lot of transportation. But for some reason, I think my mom just really had some sort of car curse, because no matter what car she got, it would always go south. Luckily, her brother was a mechanic. But she had different values about money than what people thought was typical. So one of the things is that even though we lived in South Central Los Angeles, she made sure that I went to the most prestigious private schools. So as a result, there were times we didn't have utilities, we would have no food. And I don't mean like not what I want, I mean like no food. And we would have this car. We had this Volkswagen. It was a 1968 Beetle, blue. Light blue, if anyone remembers those. Well, most of it was blue. It had a red hood. And one of the fenders was kind of like primer color. And then one of them was kind of like my brother had bungee corded it on. And it was inclined to smoke and do backfires. And so when we go to this school, which is one of the richest schools in the area, my mom, would she drop us out front? Oh no. She has to drive into the school with the black billowing smoke and the thing, right? I mean, you get out and you're like, you had to pry the door open. And I mean, it was a piece of work, that car. We had that car for years, and she refused to be embarrassed about it. And would she go, would drive right up in front of the church, right up in front of the school, then we're just like, oh God, make it end. Because what her value was that she didn't care about the rest. We were going to get a good education. And I think that was a reflection of her values. But the question about poverty was she also had this belief, which I never was really sure about, was this idea that God loved poverty. The idea that you were closer to God when you gave up stuff. And I was never really sure, so as I've grown and learned and explored my own realities around it, sometimes I'll see, kind of guilt if I'm feeling like if my life is looking a little more prosperous than maybe the one I came up. And so then I start looking at, maybe I shouldn't be, having a prosperity consciousness. And there was all these, evidence, things that she would read in the Bible. Not just, my mother. It was a whole thought that, they would say people would misquote, the love of money is the root of all evil. They would say money was the root of all evil. And so it became kind of this weird space of how do you deal with prosperity consciousness from a spiritual point of view. And I wanted to kind of talk about prosperity consciousness. I loved this book. One of his first points is that genuine wealth is a consciousness that realizes its inborn oneness with eternal cause, the very source of all that is. And when we start looking at who we are in connection with the divine source, when we look at who is God that we're one with, right? So God is, when you look at the inherent nature of God, there's no lack. It's just impossible, right? It isn't like, well, we kind of had a sunlight this morning, but there wasn't quite enough sun today, folks. You know, there isn't quite enough of what we need to make the world go round, so we can only have half a day. Like, there's no such thing as spirit not having enough. It just doesn't exist. There is inherent in the universe a wholeness and a completeness. There is perfection and harmony. And everything that has anything to do with God is in fullness and in completeness and in harmony and in beauty and in joy. The whole picture is there, right? So it's not like when I go into treatment and I start looking for, you know, some healing that, you know, that somebody's like, oh, money doesn't grow on trees, or pulling out their pockets and counting their change. There's no such thing as poverty consciousness in the divine. And so as we realize that there is no poverty or lack in the divine, when we know that we are inherently connected with the divine source, we realize that that wholeness is us as well, that we are intricately connected to an everlasting source. And there's no such thing as there not being enough. The only thing that stops it from being enough is what? Of course, our belief and our limitation and our connection. Our belief that we're somehow separated from that, or that there's a circumstance that's greater or mightier than this divine flow. So our intention then around prosperity becomes not about looking at what seems to be the circumstances in my life right now around my finances. It involves looking at who I'm connected to, looking at my source. And the more, like we talked about on Sunday, how Deepak Chopra talked about how divine consciousness is infinite potentiality, and that it is our connection to that infinite potentiality that defines what we are able to bring into the world, what we're able to bring into the life in our lives, what we're able to bring into this world for other people's lives. It's all about our connection with the Spirit. And like we always say in our Wednesdays, it's not about because someone told you. It's about our experience, and it's about our relationship with feeling that, with knowing that, with going into treatment, with going into prayer, with deepening our experience of the divine. So when we talk about seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you, what are all the things that will be added? What does that mean? Well, we know that that means that as we are deeply connected with the divine, that we are connected with infinite source. And so all we need is there. Then it becomes weird, because then we start looking at, well, what about all the other people who don't have things? What about all the people who, you'll hear people who say, well, what about the people who are in poverty? And what about people who are starving? And, why should I have this, entitlement to live in prosperity and wealth and abundance when all these people are starving? Well, what better way to address the issues of people that are starving, of people that are experiencing lack, than by having, in a space of oneness, our expansion of our own capacity to receive, the expansion of our capacity to be in the flow of the universe. If you think about it, I always think that whenever I'm in a situation where I overcome a battle, when I overcome an obstacle, that I am somehow pushing out, that I'm somehow taking ground, not just for myself, but for other people as well. So when I have a space where I'm able to give up that there's not enough, in that space I've pushed back that egoic ground and I've created an energetic field of there is enough. And I can start exuding that in my life, not just for myself, but for other people as well. So that I am doing this internal work, but because we're one with God and one with all, when I take ground for me, I took ground for you too. So it stops being a conversation about being selfish around prosperity. It becomes a conversation about the work that I'm doing. I'm not just doing for myself, I'm doing it for other people. And of course, obviously, whenever we know that we have more, then we can give more. The more I flow, that flows in, the more that flows out. So at some point we realize with Dr. Beckwith when he says, at first we have to give to live. And then we start to transform that into we live and give. It stops being about we have to constantly acquire for ourselves, and it transforms into there's such a flow that giving naturally flows from our heart. So it stops being about, oh, how much do I have to pay? Or how much do I have to, what are my bills? It starts to naturally flow because there's so much, you're in the law of circulation. His second point is that wealth is an energy, a symbol of supply. And that when we surrender to wealth consciousness, we have to recognize that it's already ours. It's already part of our inherent wholeness. So sometimes I think people feel like, oh, I need a prosperity consciousness. I need to develop a prosperity consciousness. You'll hear people worry about whether or not they have a poverty consciousness. But the reality of it is that our spirits are whole and perfect. And so we automatically seek this space of wholeness in every area of our lives, in our wealth, in our relationships, in everything around us. We naturally seek that because it's already a part of who we are. Money is part of the energy flow, but it's not the ultimate point of why we're here. It's just part of the game, right? And we're going to get to that because, we're always talking about how life is just a game and we're just here to play it. When we treat for ourselves and our others, we are exploring new worlds. And so when we take on that I get to get the best, we're actually not being materialistic. It's interesting when, a lot of times you'll hear about people like figures that were deep spiritual figures. And a lot of times you think about them, you think about, like Abraham in the Bible. He was somebody who owned an enormous wealth. You think about people like Melchizedek, where they had a lot of wealth. And there's such a thing as these sage kings of old who had limitless wealth, who were kings. You have the wealth of Solomon. You have all this wealth. And there are people who say, well, how can I be justifying myself having things? You hear things in the Bible where they say, it's easier for a rich man to get through through an eye of a needle, a camel to get through an eye of a needle than to somebody who's rich to get into heaven. Like, what does that mean? Well, what it really means is that it's not about what you have. It's about our attachment to what we think is true. So if I actually believe that what I'm driving or what I'm wearing in any way defines who I am, then I'm missing the mark. There are times where we'll say, oh, if I have the right job, or if I have the right contract, or if I have the right life circumstances, then I'm safe, right? And so I started looking at one of the things that I had said I wanted to do was I wanted to pay off my house. And I started thinking about, well, why do I want to pay off my house? Well, I mean, it'd be kind of nice not to write that mortgage check every month. But why? And I started realizing it's like, well, I need to save for a rainy day. If something doesn't go well, at least I know I have that. And then I started tracing it back, like, wow, what's really going on is I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I'm worried that I have to plan for this terrible event because it could happen, and not realizing that when I'm doing that, I'm putting my faith in the wrong place. My faith is not in my source, because Spirit is my source. And so when we look at these people who had all this wealth, it's about our attachment. We're not here to do our ego's development. We're not here to say, that this means something about me, right? And so many times people will look at us and make a judgment. Sometimes we look at ourselves and make a judgment like, oh, that person must be X, Y, and Z because they have this or they have that, or they don't have this or they don't have that. And so it's important for us to look at what are we making it mean? What am I making it mean when I have something? What am I making it mean when I don't have something? And looking at what is it that we're glorifying, right? I remember there was a time where, I don't know if I've told you this story. There was a time when I was a kid where we had no food. Like there was nothing in the house. And my mother used to go to the a farmer's market. And there was a woman there who used to sell turnips. And she would cut the tops of the turnips, and then she would just throw away the tops of the turnips. My mom was like, well, those are turnip greens. So she would go every Tuesday and say, can I have the tops of those? And the lady was like, well, I'm just trash, I'm throwing it away. So she would get these big brown bags of the turnip greens, and literally, we had turnip greens and ramen for months. I was so sick of ramen, so sick of turnip greens. But then I started getting a taste for them, and now I love them. But what was ingenious about that was that my mother found a way to keep us, and those turnip greens have a lot of vitamins and minerals, and it was good for us. We were very healthy. We didn't look like we had no food. But the consciousness around there was how creative. And the other consciousness was like, I'm the hero because I'm surviving. Right? And so it became like, well, look what I did to survive. And I started seeing that consciousness in myself. One of the things that I went to this elite private school, and I didn't have clothes, so I would do artwork and buy clothes at the thrift shop. And then I would resew, I would take them apart and resew them into the styles that were that day. And, and I would always have little leftover pieces, so I would have like a little hair braid or a little purse or something that matched my skirts. And people would say, how did she do that? And I was like, I was like coordinated, It was, so there was this belief around being creative about being poor. But what I had to realize was that on some level I was actually glorifying it. So we'd sit with our friends and say, well, I was so poor that, you hear people say, I was so poor, my pants were so thin, I could sit on a dime and tell if it was heads or tails, People would make a joke out of, or, glorify, we were so poor that, right? And so I had to extricate that from my consciousness and realize that there was some ego identification with, we have come so far, right? The thing is that we're not here to accumulate wealth. We're not here to actually obtain prosperity. Because prosperity and wealth is just one of the games that we're playing. So it doesn't matter if we're playing a game for prosperity, or if we're playing a game for health, or if we're playing a game for love, or if we're playing a game for relationships, or friendships, or vacations, or whatever it is. Whatever that thing is, that divine opulence is our natural inheritance. So it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. So once we realize that the money game is just a game, then we realize that how we get to that space is just a marker of something else. We start looking at, I'm playing this money game. What are my barriers between me and this money game? It could be that this consciousness of poverty doesn't just show up as money. It could show up as maybe there's not enough friends. It could show up as maybe there's not enough in the world. Maybe it can show up as, there's something wrong, I'm not safe, or it's dangerous. There's all these things that show up. And so our job really is to continue to align ourselves with the divine source, knowing that there is endless goodness, that there is endless opulence, and that Spirit has no other intention for us but that we live in that beauty. And then we start looking at what are the things in me that are stopping the flow. It's very simple. At the end of the game, we don't own anything. At the end of the game, when we shrug off these physical bodies, what are we actually left with? Well, what we're left with is what we learned. What we're left with is the spiritual development. What we're left with is our eternal spirit that has been deepened, that we had a deeper experience of the divine because we played these games. But when we play the games as if that's who we really are, or if it means something about us, the truth about us, we actually, by doing that, lose. So we become stewards of all that we have, not owners. We become the stewards of the money and the resources. We become stewards of these bodies. We become stewards of our relationships. We become stewards of the jobs. And we become someone who is, I'm about my Father's business. So we give up hoarding and accumulating and gathering to us the things in the material realm, and we begin to hoard our spiritual experiences, which really is all there is, and that's all that's real. So when we start looking at prosperity and we get it's just a game, there becomes this inner trust. There becomes a space of inner freedom where we're no longer afraid that we don't have something. We just tap into the flow. So whatever is happening, whatever looks like circumstances, we know that we are always in the divine arms of the divine. We know that we are taken care of. We know that just as we would feed our kids and clothe them and have them in the best, that there's a divine Father and Mother that has that for us. Whenever you've given to someone that you truly love, and you've felt that joy in knowing that they have that, that's the joy that the divine feels when we learn to be in the flow and we learn to accept what is our innate gifts and our divine inheritance. So as we go through the week, the challenge is to look at every area of our lives and start recognizing what is our source. My employment isn't my source. My contracts are not my source. The divine spirit is my source. And continually realizing that there is one job I have here on this planet right now, and that's to deepen my awareness of the divine in me in every way. So I want to let's go into our meditation.